Tennessee wasn't the only one to make recruiting news over the weekend. We started the weekend laughing at Florida, and then we ended the weekend saying, Florida is making a huge push. So for those who don't know, Florida lost another player who flipped from after losing a player to Georgia last week. They lost a quarterback who flipped from them to Ole Miss. And I was ready to come in on Monday, Jaru, and just lay into Florida and joke about how much of a disaster they are and how much trouble they're in. And then they pick up 4 commitments right after that, 4 Elite 4 stars. And now they have the number 8 rate recruiting class, and Tennessee's fallen number 13. Was this just because they did some visits early, so they hit their jackpot this weekend and it's going to fade out, or is this a sign of Billy Napier doing things to come?
I think it's not as big of a deal as fans want to make it, just because a lot of the guys were projected to go to Florida anyway, whether they committed now or in November or October, they were probably going to end up at Florida anyway. So I really think Florida just piled all of which Tennessee's doing next weekend, piled all of their highest targets and the guys they want and who are priorities in their class in the same weekend, and then just happened to get them all to commit in the same weekend, because it was some of the kids, like this weekend, a lot of kids went to Tennessee wanting on their official visit to compare it to their other top schools and see what was happening. Everybody except one that I know of went into Florida this weekend, kind of confirming their decision to commit to Florida, if that makes sense. So there was no convincing them to commit. It was more of like they had it in their mind already. The only guy that kind of worries me-ish is 4-star defensive lineman Amaris Williams from North Carolina. He was supposed to be on campus next weekend with Tennessee and was one of their top guys. And he committed to Florida this weekend. Aside from him, I don't think any of the other commitments were big surprises.
Okay. Is Amaris Williams still visiting Tennessee next weekend, or has he decided to shut things down?
If I had to bet, he'll probably cancel his visit, but that hasn't been confirmed yet.
Yeah, the only reason I say that is they've already suffered 2 decommitments, so you never know what else.
It's true. And it's weird that after the whole NIL situation in December, that doesn't affect their recruiting at all. Because not just from a money standpoint, I would think just from like how can you trust a school? How can you trust what Florida promises you if they couldn't even come through with, one of the top guys in the country?
Yeah, and for those who don't know, Jaden Rashada had committed to Florida. Florida had promised him NIL money, and then they backed off, and then apparently they didn't have the money to pay. The story behind that, Dave and I talked about this. We know a little bit more. Dave, last year at SEC Media Days, I think it was SEC Media Days, had a couple of people telling him that Florida's way behind the curve on NIL. I did a report in my old blog a month later from On3 that Florida had just launched one of the 5 largest NIL initiatives. So I remember Dave and I talking like, what's going on? These 2 stories don't jive up. Well, it sounds like Florida threw together a collective really fast that was a Ponzi scheme. It was a Bernie Madoff-style Ponzi scheme, and they didn't really have the money they said they did. They were just worried about Miami, who had thrown together a very effective collective. So I think that issue is still there with Florida, and you wonder if they got it right. That's a good question. That's tricky why players would still commit to Florida, given that fact, particularly out in North Carolina. But this is early. I got to ask. Now, for those who – the thing is, everybody overreacts in June because you can brag about a top 5 class in June, but so many times I've covered recruiting, Alabama doesn't have a top 20 class in June, and then they have the number 1 class. Right now, they don't have a top 20 class. So do you think it's anything for Tennessee to worry about that they picked up Boo Carter, but they fell to number 13, and right now Stanford and Minnesota are ranked higher than them on 247 Sports?
I don't think so. A lot of the guys, like I said previously, a lot of the guys they had this weekend on campus are recruitments that will probably go the distance. I know a couple plan to commit in July, but I mean, you look at like August, September commitments, even all the way to Kamarion Franklin, who I don't know if he still is planning it, but was previously planning to commit on signing day. So you have a lot of commitments that'll go the distance. I don't want to sound the alarms too early. Another thing is with Florida, they might, if they got the number 1 class, how much do you trust Florida to coach those guys up and be successful on the field, just aside from the recruiting standpoint? Because yes, Billy Napier was good at Louisiana Lafayette, but he hasn't proven anything at Florida yet. So I don't want to sound the alarms on if maybe in 2 years he manages to turn 5 stars into good college football players.
Yeah, and Jaru, as you probably know better than anybody, Louisiana Lafayette, as a smaller school, you need gas money to get talent there. You know, the smaller players in Louisiana are, I mean, the ones that aren't good enough to play Power Five, they're better in Louisiana than they are anywhere else, and they'll stay in Louisiana if you recruit them.
Yeah, and I mean, there is some. I mean, he did have to like build up talent and coach players up at Lafayette, but still, like you said, like in Louisiana, if a guy isn't going to LSU or another SEC school, he's probably just going to stay in state. And why would he go to Louisiana Tech if Lafayette extended him an offer? So you're right. It's very easy to recruit in Louisiana if you're a smaller school compared to a smaller school in, I don't know, Michigan or Minnesota. But we still haven't seen Billy Napier have success at Florida. And with the schedule they're going to have this year, I don't know if we'll see him have success at all. So it'll be curious to see if he can coach up talent and have turn 4 stars that he all got on the same weekend into college players who can play football.
Yeah, and it's funny you bring that up because Napier is considered like a new Nick Saban, detail-oriented guy. But the thing about that like details versus X's and O's. But the thing about it is Nick Saban has done that, bringing number 1 ranked recruiting classes left and right for years and years. Florida is not really a school, and a lot of people think it is because of the state of Florida with talent. But guys, you're competing with Florida State and Miami and Georgia and Alabama, which get a lot of talent from the Florida Panhandle. Florida's not a school equipped to churn out number 1 recruiting classes every single year. And they're not that top tier job. There's only 3 schools that are equipped to churn out top 3 recruiting classes every year, regardless of the coach, no matter what. And that's Georgia, LSU, and Ohio State. That's it. There's a second tier that can be, if Florida hired Nick Saban, they'd get the number 1 class every year, but that's because they hired Nick Saban. But they can't just hire an up-and-comer and churn out number 1 recruiting classes like that. And so that's kind of the big issue. Notice I brought up Nick Saban. Nick Saban, where did he become a high-profile coach? LSU, which is one of the schools where you can turn out those type of classes. So I think Billy Napier, I don't know what Florida was thinking with this, Jaru, because historically they've been at their best when they had a schematically skilled coach ahead of the curve.
Well, I think even bigger now, you talk about ahead of the curve. If Florida even wanted to get a top 5 class, they'd have to have a capable NIL collective. That's just how the way football works now. I mean, you look at Texas, got Arch Manning. Texas doesn't get number 1 classes, but they have the NIL to get number 1 classes. Alabama, yes, Nick Saban is a good recruiting pitch, but they also are capable of giving you NIL money. We saw with Jaden Rashada that Florida is not there yet. So why, if Billy Napier wanted a 5-star and went to his collective, or the collective wanted a 5-star and went to the kid, why would anybody trust Florida's NIL collective, whether it's been fixed or not? So that's another big thing with recruiting now, if you want to talk about ahead of the curve. And Billy Napier could bring in good assistant coaches that can get the job done and be schematically good. But I agree with you. Nothing about Billy Napier screams X's and O's and a really good play caller or drawing up amazing plays. So it's a really, I don't know. We'll see, I'm sure in 2 years if there's another coaching search, but I don't know how much Billy Napier can have success being that detail-oriented guy when he has 3 stars and 4 stars who aren't ready to play.
Yep. So we're both in agreement that this past weekend wasn't that big of a deal, even though Florida had a splash and Tennessee fell to number 13. We think it'll all balance itself out eventually.
If this weekend happened in December and Tennessee fell to 13, then we could sound the alarms. But it's still June. I mean, official visits aren't even done yet, so I think there's a ton of time. And Florida is one of those schools, I guess, like I said, a lot of those kids are just confirming their decisions. You don't see schools like Florida or Tennessee pressing kids to commit. Now, if Nick Saban was pushing a kid to commit that weekend of his visit, then that might be a little different. But I would, especially Florida, I don't see them being in a position where they have the leeway or the leverage to like press a kid to commit during his visit.